Okay, good afternoon. So for the next 1.5 hours, we'll have an exciting debate about how to collaborate philosophy and science for consciousness research. So the structure is going to be, we will have two speakers, Hakwan Lau and Shogo Tanaka. Each of them will present his thesis for 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for general discussion. And towards the end of the time, we'll ask the speakers to wrap up their discussion again. So the first speaker will be Hakwan Lau, and he'll present his position.
Hello. So, nice to see you guys. Thanks for having me back here in Okazaki after maybe 10 years or so. I think we were here almost a decade ago. Some of you know what I do. This is very far from what I usually do. I run a lab. I used to do some psychophysics and a little bit of agency stuff. But really, these days, what I do is neurofeedback, in particular multivoxel neurofeedback, and using it to treat affective disorder. So this is quite different from what I usually do, and in particular, I think I'm invited because I do hang out with philosophers a lot. I have published papers with philosophers. There's another one coming. I'm writing my own philosophy paper too, and besides these co-authors like David Rosenthal, Richard Brown, I also, one of my best mentor and friend and colleague is Ned Block. When we both lived in New York City, I have learned my philosophy mostly from him. So I have a lot of respect for philosophy. I also have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. So for today to take the negative position is a story. It's mostly because when Tanaka-san and I were coming through this debate, we think that we're both reasonable people. We're probably going to have too much to agree and not enough to disagree. So in order to make a debate, I'm trying to sound as negative as possible. So some of it's deliberate to try to provoke and explore the positions. So I'm going to first start off with a couple of things I feel as a scientist over the years working with so many philosophers. Two, I would say almost like beginners, common mistakes that philosophers make when trying to interact with scientists. And once I explain, you'll see why that usually doesn't lead to very fruitful collaboration. The first is for philosophers to come in and look at your experiment and say, well, why don't you do this experiment instead? Wouldn't it be nice if you do exactly this? And scientists usually don't like it. I mean, some of them express it more than others. But the reason is, in science, of course it would be nice to do those experiments, but time and funding is limited, right? So if you come in as a philosopher trying to tell us what we do, it's like we don't like to be bossed around by you. I know these are interesting, of course we can do it, but we have other concerns. And we're not like just to produce experiments to entertain you. We have to compete for our jobs, our funding and stuff. So sometimes people get written off in the philosopher's thought. The scientists are not interested in the issue or not enthusiastic about interdisciplinary research. Well, they are, but they have their concerns. You know, their funding, some experiment may be expensive to do, and the graduate student might need to go to the job market next year. There are other concerns that, before you really step into their shoes and think about what their concerns are, it's too easy to just propose, oh, you'd be nice if you do this. Yeah, it would be, but we're not your bitches. So that's that. And then something related is another line of, I think, another thing that people like to do. One kind of stereotype person who does it a lot is a guy called Peter Hacker, who wrote a long book about, based on this Wittgensteinian argument, who like to say, oh, you guys experiments, this concept, the grammar of the concept is unclear, and try to point out how to police us, how to use the words correctly. Say, you guys said representation, but what you really mean is intentional, content-driven in a dynamical system. Some words that actually, at the end of the day, maybe you guys were right, but quite often it doesn't matter. So here's a case where, just an example where we actually got criticized for saying that we shouldn't distinguish between actions that are internally generated versus externally triggered. There's a point. I mean, actions are all endogenous in a certain sense. I mean, there's nothing particular endogenous if you move. And then they were accusing us for infinite regress, and we're assuming that there's a little man in your head and that triggered the action. Yeah, we get that. I mean, we read all this Gilbert Ryle and stuff, and we also read Jeremy Fodor's reply to all of that too. So I basically, I know these arguments, but in the end, in science, we are not trying to speak the most beautiful language to be a poet or something. We try to get things done. And we know that in the brain there are different circuits that will be excited by different actions. And namely, if you throw me a ball and I catch it, and it's kind of reacting to external immediate stimulus, that's one type of thing. And then if you ask me to just like choose an action and then move without immediate stimulus, that's a different type of circuit. We need a terminology to distinguish them. You might not want to call it internal, external, whatever. You can call it type A, type B, or whatever. But we just need sometimes a convenient word to hold a fussy concept so we can get by and do our experiments. So to the extent that your criticism is just a matter of like the grammar correctness of the concept, really it's very hard to get us to care. You better tell us how it would really matter, not just to your philosophical analysis, but to our experiments too. If you show that, well, if you confuse this, then actually your analysis would turn out to do something wrong, blah, 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 and so you end up with misinterpreting your data to the way that would make sense to us, to the way that it would really matter to us, to the way that it would affect the way we do our job. And I have to emphasize that as if we are more important than you. No, it is not, but I think it's important to recognize there is a kind of fundamental difference in the power dynamics. We are the one actually doing the work. It's very easy to tell us what to do, but to do it takes time and energy and money. How are we doing with time?
You have 5 minutes.
Good. So the other thing, I think, related to concepts and theory, I think this is important, particularly, so far what I said is probably true for general speaking, like philosophers and science. I think particularly true for consciousness. And I think sometimes people confuse that, and they don't think of consciousness as a branch of biology. Most of what we do is really neurobiology. If you think of the double helix structure, I think is a good example. You can sit in your armchair and theorize, come up with equations. You will never get to the double helix structure. The double helix structure is an empirical discovery. Of course, you can fit equations to it. You can develop concepts around that, but ultimately it's an empirical thing. So Philip Kitcher famously talked about how genetics, you can't just reduce it to physics. It doesn't work. We try to actually write out the principles of reduction. It's extremely complicated. So by and large, a lot of the time we try to take fussy concepts like genetics or life, and we actually try to map out the data. This is what really most of the time what we do. The concepts, the conceptual elegance, all of this quite often doesn't work. In particular, a priori axiomatic reasoning usually doesn't work. Oftentimes they actually backfire. So in the case, if you guys want to think of a good example is historically, for many of you who do philosophy or might want to contribute, one thing you can contribute is actually read up on the history and philosophy of science. And good examples like Schrödinger wrote a book called What is Life and tried to write down the mathematical equations that define life from a top-down way. Fans of free energy principle should read that, because that basically anticipated much of this current stuff, and it really made no impact to biology whatsoever. I mean, people sometimes cite it because Schrödinger is famous and it's nice to say I'm inspired by that, but it really directly made zero impact. If anything, it just distracted people to do some crazy math. So what you need is really facts. What you need is not a bunch of equations and complicated concepts and stuff. I mean, those usually don't work. But facts are difficult. This is another thing I think is hard to appreciate for philosophers. You give me the facts, and give me the facts, I philosophize for you. It doesn't quite work like that. So just to check your anatomy, who thinks that the prefrontal cortex is on the right, on that side? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's on this side? 2 AFC, so choose one. You think the prefrontal cortex is on this side or that side? This side? That side? Who think it's completely gone? So my co-authors, who are very well-known people, Christoph Karl, Tononi, and those people, highly established scientists, look at this picture together with us, and they said the prefrontal cortex is completely gone here. This is actually in print. It's in the Journal of Neuroscience, the flagship journal for Society for Neuroscience. Let's not say who's right or wrong. So the argument was the frontal sulcus is very much near here, so that basically the prefrontal cortex used to be further out and it's gone. The ring will look very long to me, and I think you can count the number of cells in parietal. This is like a first-year medical student's exercise that you can do. But regardless of who's right, I think you can just getting the basic facts sometimes is maddeningly hard. They don't agree, and after we pointed out, I think you guys are wrong. They just repeat the same claims over and over in other places. So to get the scientists to agree on some very basic facts, such as whether the frontal cortex is on this picture, sometimes it's hard. It's really that hard. We can talk about why it is that hard and why it is particularly so hard in our field, but I'm telling you this is a reality. And given this, like how are you going to get like any kind of explanation to be done? For instance, if you think H2O is water, you think, oh, this is a reduction problem, it's quite hard. Well, it's harder still because some people are going to say H3O is water. It makes no chemical sense, but even the basic facts are going to be controversial. And if you think H3O is water, then no wonder it's such a hard problem, you would not be able to explain why water is a colorless liquid in room temperature. Because if the basic facts are wrong. And in our field, quite often we are still debating about very, very basic facts. So talking about reductionism, hard problem, qualia, no wonder those are hard. You don't even get the basic facts right first. You see what I mean? So here's a case of talking about, let's say you have the basic facts right. Why talking about concepts are so difficult, and sometimes that's more harm than good. Again, I'm really trying to be provocative. Remember, secretly I like philosophy, but I'm just trying to find the worst cases where I think sometimes it actually does more harm than good, and then I'll finish. The last point is really about necessity and sufficiency, which you philosophers are in love with. I think by and large, when applied to a biological system or consciousness, it is a bad thing. For instance, think of the engine of your car. The engine of your car, you might think this is very important for it's moving around, and it is important, it's causal, but it's actually neither necessary nor sufficient for its moving around if you do your, logic 101. It's not necessary because take out the engine, you can push the car can still move. Or maybe you hook it to an electric motor, or you might have a second engine, so there could be redundancy. It's not sufficient because when you have the engine but I take off your wheels, then your car still don't move. When you have a system with multiple parts like that, talking about necessity and sufficiency is very difficult. You need to have these background conditions and brackets, etc. And most of the time we don't do it. And this language, you can see it influence scientists in a bad way. So this is actually from Christoph Koch, one of the proponents of the NCC project. If you read this passage, you would be clear that he no longer is doing the NCC project. You may not know it, but this is a totally different kind of project. So the NCC project started in the 90s when Francis Crick was still alive, and we want to find the neural correlates of consciousness. We emphasize the word correlates because we want to sidestep the important conceptual issues. We don't want to say it's neural identity because that is subscribing too much to identity theory. We don't want to say it's a cause because a thing cannot cause itself. So if it's causal, then it's not identity. So let's just say correlates. So two things correlate. So let's just ignore the metaphysical implications and find things that correlate first. But here you can already see these are not correlates. So basically he's saying that the formal definition is a bunch of stuff that minimally, jointly determines our conscious experience, and any change in the NCC will, of necessity, change the character of the experience. That is wrong. If you think about it, this is not a correlate. This is a neural constituency of consciousness. Because in this case, if you change the NCC, the experience necessarily will change. What it means is you're denying that there are redundancy in biology. You see what I mean? If you have, let's say my left hand right now is the minimal thing that needs to hold my microphone because my left hand is weaker than my left hand. I can hold it in either. But my left hand is weaker, so this is the minimal thing. This is the correlate for my microphone holding behavior. But if you change my left hand, if you tie it up, in fact, it's going to do no change whatsoever to the function because this function has redundant basis. And we know that in biology system, usually it's like that. It's like if you have left prefrontal cortex, you have right prefrontal cortex. You cut off one of them, you should not necessarily expect to change the experience. Once you do that, you're not talking about a neural correlate anymore. You're talking about really an identity claim. It's like H2O. If you have H2O, if you change the O, it's not water anymore. There's no redundancy. Those kind of one-to-one direct mapping. In the brain, to assume there is this one-to-one direct mapping is a lot to assume. So we're slipping in these things in the old NCC project. I pointed out to him, it's very difficult to agree. The funny thing is, Dave Chalmers the philosopher, great philosopher, my hero, was actually on that mailing list. But he didn't actually take my side. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my philosophy was not good enough. We can talk about that more. But I end with this point. I think, not to assume my hero has done exactly that, but I think it's a natural human tendency. We like to take sides. So Dave, over the last few years, of course, has expressed views to say, well, scientists now agree with me that panpsychism is true. And of course, scientifically, you cannot really test panpsychism. What he meant is, I found some friends in science who happen to be panpsychists. And he would cite these, and he would go to things and talk about that. And then meanwhile, he would go to, he edits the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and he insisted, despite some of us protested, we think certain theories should not be in the Stanford Encyclopedia for the Neuroscience of Consciousness, such as IIT, because I personally don't think it's neuroscience. In fact, I think some versions of it is just not even science. It's more like a philosophical conjecture it's just not scientifically testable. But then Dave can actually use his power as a senior philosopher to decide what goes in. This is really my last point. That is really dangerous because, and it's specific to our field. In other fields, fine, your philosophers have your own fields, the scientists have our own fields. In our field, the problem is the science is hard, the science is controversial, and the philosophers, for some historical reasons that are interesting, they hold a lot of power in our field, which is weird. If in genetics, if you have a wacky, crazy idea, good for you. This is what philosophers you're supposed to do. You're supposed to think about the far-fetched stuff. In our field, the philosophers actually have a fairly strong influence on funding decisions, on resources, on visibility. And if in those cases you are somewhat biased, you're taking the science, because science itself cannot determine itself. We cannot even agree where the central sulcus is. If a philosopher comes along and says, well, I like these scientists because they happen to share my view, and your view is a philosophical view that cannot be scientifically proven or anything, it's just that these people happen to have the same metaphysical worldview, and then you favor their theory. In fact, you're standing in the way of science. You're kind of messing with how science should be done. It should be done with peer review, and we should be evaluating based on scientific rigor. And now you're dirtying this mechanism based on rigor. In fact, I would say you're contributing to human suffering because you're slowing down the progress of science. It suddenly becomes really not so funny anymore. So this is my most negative, provocative view. I don't really think it's always true, but I think there's a danger we should concern. This basically sums up what I just said. I end with this quote from my colleague Alcino Silva. Think not what science can do for you, but what you can do for science. I think it's a very dangerous thing if you come in as a philosopher of science. Think how you can sample and find all these like extreme views by some unresolved scientific issue. Find some evidence to support your view. That usually will lead to bad behavior. But if you, on the other hand, you come in and try to be fair and help us do our rigorous peer review, you can do a good job after all. Thank you.
So our second speaker is Shogo. He's gonna take a somewhat opposite position on this question. He also have like about 10 minutes to
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here to join the debate. And well, I am supposed to push philosophy in a very positive way, but before that, I have not a slide. It's could be a serious problem. I have been attending this conference, and this is the very first time to attend this kind of consciousness conference. And I have been listening all the presentations since yesterday, and most of the philosophical ideas have their own background in the analytic tradition, right? And I am originally from the phenomenology, and I'm trying to bring some phenomenological ideas into the consciousness research, or well, my own specialty is embodiment, so I'm trying to give some fresh ideas from phenomenological background into the embodiment research. So well, I'm trying to push hard in a positive manner the value of philosophy here, but my background is not analytical, so well, I am in a kind of dilemma here, right? Well, okay, so my talk is gonna be a bit vague than Hakwan's one. That I titled my talk as how to conceptualize consciousness, and the idea behind this title is that probably if you are engaged in some sort of consciousness research in the scientific side or in philosophical side, probably you are explicitly or implicitly committed already to some sort of philosophical idea. That is the point that I would like to talk about today. And well, let me briefly take up a couple of major ideas what have been discussed and debated so far so many times. But I'd like to sum up once again the major ideas to show that probably most of the scientific researchers are well, implicitly or explicitly influenced by the philosophers' ideas. Okay, so the very first one that we need to reconsider is the mind-body dualism. Okay, and well, of course, in the morning session, John also referred to this program that mind and matter. Well, Descartes conceptualized that mind and matter are two different substances, right? And subjective thought and objective extensions. And Descartes considered, but here the point which connects the Cartesian thought and the current researchers of consciousness, because although Descartes divided into two spheres of the world, into two, like subjective thought and objective extensions, but he finally emphasized the importance of the pineal body in the brain is a very special place where the mind interacts with the body. So it's not really separated in his idea that there is a special place left in this world that had the name brain, right? So brain, he put the brain as a special matter in this world where the consciousness or the mind and matter could interact with each other. And well, in half century later, another philosopher, Leibniz, pointed out that there is a gap here, that subjective thought cannot be observed or directly perceived by examining brain processes. And this idea was, of course, handed down to the so-called explanatory gap that was proposed by Joseph Levine, right? And well, of course, Chalmers reformulated this explanatory gap in the name of hard problem of consciousness. And this way of conceptualizing the idea relocate this gap as a problem to be solved by explicating the neural processes in the brain from which conscious experiences arise, right? And probably all those who are engaged in the research of NCC probably is in this line of conceptualizing consciousness, that this conception supported the scientific research on neural correlated consciousness since 1990s. Well, this is the first idea, and the second one is the Thomas Nagel, and what is it like? Well, this is another very important idea, that Nagel conceptualized the problem of consciousness in terms of subjective field of direct experiences. And he emphasizes the quality of experiences given through the very first person perspective. So it is continuous with the very idea of the qualia, right? And well, in the field I am a bit familiar with, the research on perceptual illusions have been an important clue to understanding qualia so far. That he's well, are you familiar with this illusion? Good. Well, this is so-called checker shadow illusion, which was published by Edison in 1995. That you can see the square here marked A. There is another figure marked B, and it is very hard to see that they are optically the same shade of gray, where the square marked A and the square marked B. But you can see through, well, with the aid of this another figure, you can see that they are the same shade of gray in optical manner. But it is very difficult to tell when you're watching this figure. It is very difficult to tell. But this kind of research, well, which was originally, well, promoted with the aid of the concept of qualia, well, it clarified, well, the scientific research which had been with the aid of the concept of qualia could promote the scientific research on perceptual consciousness, at least, right? And because, well, when we know from this figure, we know that the importance of the context of spatial context, when we are watching at the square A and when we are watching the square B, we are in a different spatial context, and that spatial context makes the difference in our subjective perceptual experiences, right? Okay, but on the other hand, what is it like was a very, in a sense, a radical, more radical notion that, well, scientific research on qualia never gets rid of the problem of the other minds. Well, the problem of the other mind was hinted by John in this morning, that was the harder problem of consciousness, and which was originally involved in Nagel's question, because he wanted to discuss what is it like to be a bat, right? So what is it like involved the question of another person, or another animal, or machine, or robots, or whatsoever, who may or may not have the subjective experiences I had. So, well, this line of research would be continuous with the scientific research on the animal consciousness, or the robot's consciousness, or machine consciousness, or at times with the consciousness of the people in very particular states, such as vegetative states, or altered states of consciousness. Okay, this is the second one. Okay, the third one, the Freud idea. Freud was not really a philosopher, but I think his thought was kind of very important important topic, because his idea of unconscious was based on the clinical observation that there are mental processes that the patient themselves are not aware of. So Freud actually denies the primacy of awareness that we always put in the context of scientific research of consciousness, but he denied the primacy of awareness in understanding consciousness. So probably his view is continuous to the idea of the accessibility or the inaccessibility of consciousness in the scientific research. Well, maybe we can put, well, this is Masatoshi's specialty. Maybe we can take up the blind sight as an example. That the patient with blind sight not visually aware of the stimuli, right? But they somehow can respond to the stimuli through concrete behavior, like this figure that she cannot visually aware of the direction of the slit, right? But she can somehow insert the card into this slit. That happens with the patient with blind sight. So, well, here is the problem of accessibility and inaccessibility and the primacy of awareness. Maybe we can conceptualize from this phenomenon. Well, and this suggests that visual information processing and the brain does not always correspond to the conscious experience of the stimuli. So we can say, well, maybe we can generalize from this fact that it is needed to explicate how the subpersonal or unconscious neural processes contribute to the conscious experience. And probably this would involve the problem of the free will as well. Well, and Freud's idea from a slightly different perspective, maybe we can say that Freud's idea also suggests different levels of consciousness. He never used the term of arousal that like we use now, but he considered some sort of layers of consciousness, like daytime consciousness, and below that there is a dreaming state, and below that there is a dreamless state, etc. So this way of conceptualizing the consciousness is very continuous to the current research or altered states of consciousness, or the consciousness research through anesthesia, right? Okay, this was the third one. And the final one, I'd like to refer to Gilbert Ryle's the concept of ghosting the machine. Well, this one also John referred to this morning, well, a bit, that Ryle was criticized Cartesian view with the phrase of ghosting the machine, that Descartes distinguished the subjective substance of the mind and the objective substance of the matter, but well, how Descartes conceptualized the mind was the thinking substance, and it was independent from, but still resident in the body. So he regarded that the pineal body in the brain was the special place where the mind could interact with the body or the world. Right? So, but according to Ryle took a different position to the concept of mind. Ryle said the mind is a set of dispositions that actualize through behaviors in the given situations. So if so, mind or consciousness, in line with Ryle, mind or consciousness cannot be conceptualized apart from the acting body and its capabilities such as skills. So, well, I'd like to say that his thought was one root for what is called embodied mind or embodied cognition paradigm currently. So, well, for example, the scientific research on phantom limbs or rubber hand illusion would be an example for this line of scientific research of consciousness. They are explicating the embodied dimension of consciousness, right? Okay, so let me sum up. Well, in the past philosophy, as we have seen already, sorry for being too general for my talk today, but at least there are many ways of conceptualizing consciousness, and to a certain extent, they are continuous to the current scientific research on consciousness. So maybe we can say that whether the scientists are aware or not, they tend to be committed to a certain philosophical conception of consciousness. And well, Hakwan referred to the fact, and he emphasized what the fact is. But let's pay our attention once again. What is the fact of consciousness? Consciousness as a phenomena is very ambiguous, and so many ways of conceptualizing it. So the fact, what is the fact of consciousness? It could be 1, 2, 3, or how many types of fact of consciousness are there, and we can understand. Maybe we need to some sort of mediation of concept, maybe without being mediated by some sort of concept or philosophical concept. Maybe we cannot talk about the fact of consciousness. So whether the scientists are aware or not, they need to be committed to a certain philosophical conception of consciousness. So, well, at least it is better for the scientists to be conscious, okay, to be conscious of their own philosophical conceptions of consciousness. Well, this is my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentations. So now let's invite our two speakers to the stage. We'll open the discussion up from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, Tony?
Hello. Thanks. Thank you very much. So it's not so much a question, but quick comments on both presentations. So the first one is about Professor Tanaka's talk. So I think when Hakwan mentioned fact, he was referring to things like whether in that photo the prefrontal cortex is gone. So it's less interpretation, I think, but he can say more than I do. The second point is about Hakwan's final point about the SEP entry, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry. We had this conversation last night, but I'll say it again. So the author of that entry asked people to give feedbacks, and I was one of the commentators. So one point was that given that IIT is in the entry and many other things, maybe the entry should be called Neuroscience and Philosophy of Consciousness or Neurophilosophy of Consciousness. The reply was something like, the editorial decision has been made, so there's no way to change. So I guess this is just to echo what Hakwan just said. So lots of things has been decided by certain people who have certain views. Might or might not be harmful, but we need to be aware of those facts. Thank you.
So about the fact I was going to reply to, obviously the fact about consciousness, I wouldn't say there's one or two, and it's very controversial. But what I meant was even for some basic facts, like whether 1 + 1 equals 2, whether you look at a picture and then does this bit of anatomy still exist on the picture, these are really textbook stuff. And what I'm really trying to point out from my working on the front line for 2 decades of my life is sometimes getting those are already difficult. You might be surprised how difficult it is, but those are in print. You can check it out if you have any doubt about that. And given that, I think conceptualizing is obviously important. It is obviously important for certain things that needs to be conceptualized. But of course, conceptualizations are also controversial. So any of the philosophers you cited, like Ryle and Freud, there are people for and against them. And what I worry is this attempt to conceptualize things is just going to make the even basic fact-finding even more difficult. And I don't want to say more about the SEP entry. That might be more suited for a year afterwards. And it's really not against you, Dave, so if you're listening. It's not about it's pointing a general phenomenon that philosophers have a disproportionately large power of influence in our field than another field, and another field of science. If you're a philosopher of physics and if you say like quantum mechanics makes no sense, you're not going to take that out from the graduate education of any major graduate school training. Quantum mechanics is here to stay whether you like it or not. But whereas in our field, philosophers actually have a fairly sizable impact on what get to stay in our classics and what get to go under the main stage, what's going to go behind. And in that sense, again, the conceptualization is a good thing in itself, but because of these vested interests in our field, sometimes they can inadvertently end up doing bad things for us.
Okay, about the notion of fact, I'd like to add something. When you're a researcher in the field of neuroscience, probably you will focus on the neural processes of a certain part of the brain. But before focusing on that special part, there are so many other parts you did not focus on. So when you focus on a particular process of neural processes or a particular region of the brain, you have already committed to some sort of conceptualization. To design the context of research on the fact, you have already committed to some way of conceptualizing or identifying the process of consciousness. So that is what I wanted to add about the fact.
Any follow-ups? Okay, let's move to our next question.
Hi. So I think I want to try to connect to thoughts in a way, but I want to start with Professor Lau's. So the bad cases where philosophy have bad influences to science. You talked about, among others, you talked about 2 examples. One is NCC research, the necessity and sufficiency thing. The other thing is IIT. Yeah. But that's the. Those are the two examples where you talked about the bad impact on science. But the thing is that, I mean, those proposals are not the ones by philosophers. The scientists propose those things. So I share lots of your concerns about the kind of concerns you expressed. But the thing is that maybe those are not the cases where philosophers actively having negative impact on science. It's more like these are the cases where scientists take up some kind of philosophers or philosophical ideas and use some of those ideas in not optimal ways or something like that. So I think that if that's the case, then I wonder whether, well, I think this session is about the fruitful correlation between philosophy and science. Maybe one positive contribution philosophers can make about those issues is that maybe philosophers can clarify some issues. Because it's a necessity and sufficiency thing. I think basically I agree with you. So the problem is that scientists are not super clear about the distinction between constitution and causation, necessity and sufficiency, correlation and causation. Look, scientists tend to be not super clear about the distinction between them. On the other hand, philosophers are basically, that's what philosophers talk about. So philosophers are relatively good at making those distinctions. So one positive contributions from the philosophy side is maybe philosophers can qualify these things a little bit. So, I mean, I think that's kind of connect to Professor Tanaka's talk, because he also talks about the philosophical assumptions scientists tend to bring in. And one of your messages is that like they should be aware of these things. And then maybe that's connect, like that connects to Professor Lau's point, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. You very nicely summarize it. It's not that at least examples I gave you were not that the philosophers did the bad philosophy. It's the scientists who, because of the field, we hang out with philosophers, we borrow these bad terminologies, these axioms and concepts and theories and necessity and sufficiency without fully understanding what these things do, and then proceed to do very bad philosophy. I think that's fair. So, but I think in part, I think we picked it up from you guys a little bit. But I think what I was saying is not that part. The part was while we're doing this in the open, it's very prominently doing this. In that was an email exchange that I quoted from Christoph. I was trying to point out your definition of NCC is a betrayal to the original freaking copy NCC, and I tried to point out to him he didn't agree. And then I pointed out that there was all of these terminology about necessity and sufficiency and redundancy and plasticity was actually discussed in Dave Chalmers' 2000 paper on what is an NCC. I read it as an undergrad. And I brought it up, but the problem was Dave at that point did not intervene. Maybe, so this is a personal anecdote. I'm not saying that Dave would forever remain silent about this. Now that I've put him on the table, I hope that he would have to react to this. What I worry is philosophers do tend to, they have the capacity to come in and clarify these. My worry is really given the sociological factors surrounding the way the science goes, whether they really do this or whether they take this as a job. Or to put it positively, there's a way that I think Tanaka-san would just agree. Philosophers have the potential to do good in this field. Whether they are doing this and how do we make sure they are doing this, I think that's the danger. The danger is they have the potential to do this, but they won't. Instead, they will take the scientists, whether they're good science, bad science, whether they're doing bad philosophy, so long as they agree with their view, they would take those and, oh, I have scientific support. You see this piece of bad philosophy done by these scientists, end up having the conclusion that I like. So they end up citing them, which I think is actually, I worry is, the reality is that is happening much more often than it should, or than you guys think from the outset.
Right. So what the one, so I think one tricky issue. So I really like the part of your talk where you talk about the conceptual policing. So I think that's a really bad thing to do. I mean, so I'm really sympathetic to the kind of frustration you guys, like a scientist, feel about that. But the tricky thing is that it's not very easy to draw the distinction between bad conceptual policing you talked about and the kind of distinction you are now talking about, like in the exchange with Koch, for example. Because, you know why that's kind of conceptual policing, right? So I mean, so there are good cases and then the bad cases. And one point is that it's not really easy to draw a sharp distinction between those two cases. And the other thing is, so that's one point. The other thing is more like a sociological thing. So the scientists have been frustrated by those conceptual policing. So maybe they don't really want to listen to what. Like, yes, again, they're doing it again, just repeat it. That's not. So I mean that might make it.
Again, I think it's a very good point. I myself find it difficult too. But I think the tentative answer I can give is there are sometimes conceptual policing where it doesn't matter to the science in the end. So if you just replace all those terms, sometimes I reply to people and say like, I can give you the word template and you can use find and replace and change all the terms to another term that you like, then okay, fine. You let's call it X. I don't care what's in the word, right? But there are sometimes cases where it does matter. So in the case I point out in the Crick and Koch, mostly in Christoph's new formulation of the NCC, it does not do the job anymore. It does not sidestep those metaphysical issues anymore. It became a claim of identity, essentially, which is not what it's set out to do. So in that case, it matters. In fact, if you allow me to draw the link, that NCC claim was what led them to deny that the prefrontal cortex disappeared, because once you have that, then a unilateral lesion of prefrontal cortex is, they would expect, if PFC is part of NCC, then even a unilateral lesion would mean that it has to change the subjective experience. That debate actually comes from there. So it changes directly how you interpret patient cases and what experiments you're going to do. So I think those kind of cases would be necessary to do. And I hope that the philosophers would pick on those fights instead of pick on like whether the grammar of the concept of internal generative action is meaningful. It's like, who cares? I mean, so from our point of view, we like you guys to help actually to do things where it actually matters. But in reality, on my day job, I see you guys doing more of the annoying, giving me a trouble ticket kind of policing rather than actually helping us. But that doesn't have to be the case. And as I've said, I'm trying to be most negative today. I'm sure some positive work can be done.
I want to talk about a bit more practical issue, how to actually collaborate. Do you have any experience with collaboration with scientists and philosophers? I want to hear from your what happened exactly. In my case, I have collaborating with Dr. Taguchi and thinking about the theory of combining free energy principle with Husserlian phenomenology. So it's very interesting and very fun to talk about. But the difficulty is I have to learn Husserlian phenomenology to some extent, and Dr. Taguchi have to learn some Bayesian machine learning or this thing. So we need some not complete understanding, but some knowledge is required to start meaningful collaboration. So that is really it's fun, but it needs some effort and time. So not easy to start and not easy to efficiently extend. That is my feeling. So I want to hear from your opinion, from your experience.
Actually, there's someone behind you who was raising his hand.
I was raising a hand.
saying that they've got the same experience of collaborating with the philosophers, particularly. And I think that my first thought is just very similar to the professor's view, namely that we usually spend like probably a month or something like that to discuss the basic terms we use. But then it's quite often profitable in a sense that, sometimes I feel on a level of the details that are just related to making experiments, but do not think about like the general meaning of what you're doing, right? And on the other hand, when you're just like doing good philosophy, you're just like asking very general questions, but sometimes you're just losing like details. Like, so I think that despite definition, it should be beneficial at least theoretically. But I'm just like wondering, just asking discussants, what do you think? Whether you can think about some example of a research question in the context of your work that was solved because of your collaboration with the philosophers, or was solved because of your collaboration with the scientists?
Okay, well, in my case, I have been working with the people who are researching on the phenomenon of rubber hand illusion, and probably many of you know the rubber hand illusion, or not? Okay, rubber hand illusion is a kind of proprioceptive illusion that when the participant is touched synchronously with the rubber hand, dummy hand, right? And here the real hand, and the real hand is shut down with a screen, and the participant could not see his or her own hand, right? But at the same time, the fake hand and the real hand are touched at the same pace synchronously. The participants suddenly start to feel here is touched, and this is my arm, and so there occurs a kind of proprioceptive illusion that I am touched here, and this is and start to feel a sense of illusory sense of ownership here on the rubber hand. But when I knew the fact, and when I started to discuss, we discussed a lot what is actually happening among the participants. If they are experiencing that the real hand has moved here, or if they feeling that they have two arms, or they are experiencing a kind of extended hand from here to there, over there as one field, like part of extended body. So we tried to clarify the experiment, and we started to take an interview during the illusion itself, and we refined the experimental design after the interview, that probably the participant would be feeling through the illusion that a kind of extended hand, not the double, but extended, but we could not design a very fresh experiment in that case. So we are still struggling to design new kind of experiment in this case. So, but this could be one example, right, of the discussion between the philosopher and the experimentalist.
I think there's a broader question about how to do interdisciplinary research in general, right? So I sometimes reluctantly have to give away my age. I have dabbled in a number of different projects over the years, and I think it's a general principle that when I do any kind of collaborative research with computational guys, with monkey physiologists, with rodent physiologists, sociologists, usually the first thing I would think about is what do I bring to the table. So in a collaboration only works if both sides of the people feel that they have there's a mutual interest, and there is something they can each bring to the table that can help them to do something better. So that is kind of true even in scientist collaborations too, right? I don't collaborate just because, oh, it would be cool for me to have your data, but then if they are not getting something out of it, the relationship is not going to last for very long. So in this context, it's the same thing. I mean, what kind of skill set do philosophers have? In my own experience, strangely, the case I get most out of it is not when I have a philosopher that agree with me. I wrote those papers with David Rosenthal and Richard Brown. I enjoyed doing them. I got a lot out of them. It's not like it's negative. They might be mad at me for saying this, but I have to be truthful. What I got a lot more out of is NetBlock. We don't agree on anything. But actually, those exchanges are the most useful because Ned end up reading the literature, and he doesn't have to run experiments, so he probably can read more than I do. And he has all these like Boston connections from his Harvard and MIT days. He would find me papers that I hadn't thought of, and that challenged my view. And then I would be bringing something and say, like, what about this? And then we would argue for periods of months until we really, I think, both feel, okay, now I know really both sides of the issues. Regardless, maybe we haven't changed our mind, but we both feel, okay, we are much more equipped in doing this debate than we had started. So those are actually good ways. I mean, philosophers, the way they have to conceptualize and read papers very carefully and read a lot of them and bring in different arguments, that actually has been very useful, but it just happened to have been more useful in an adversarial collaboration.
So earlier I saw another hand from the back. Yeah, did you have a hand?
No, I'm a philosopher and I collaborated in science.
Okay, do you want to share your experience?
So I'm a philosopher, but I have done quite a bit of work in symbolic AI and cognitive science at MIT and Harvard. And my experience generally has been that the role of the philosopher, or at least my role in these interactions, has not been to define or like lay out the axiomatic basis with which everyone needs to begin. I think that's sort of obnoxious, and I would agree that would be problematic if everyone did it. But I don't think that's what philosophers are doing. I think for the most part, what philosophers are doing is actually what's after the research is done. First, it could be making sure that the assumptions that we have when we're moving forward on some sort of research project are well-founded. But most importantly, I think what's most interesting is when the research the study has concluded, and we're in fact doing our analysis. Like when I worked with Elizabeth Spelke, the developmental psychologist, she has a paper that's really wonderful, and the last 2 pages of her paper are quite theoretical and not that they're building upon the actual results of her study, but not in a way that is directly related to the results themselves. It's moving into future studies, and everything that she was saying was directly connected to philosophical papers, but she didn't have the background. Totally understandably, didn't have the background in the philosophy to note those connections. So as you were saying exactly, I think that philosophers add a lot of the theory to then move forward with future studies, and also to connect the larger questions that people have been grappling with for thousands of years with the research that's being done today.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That sounds exactly like the ideal cases. I must say you're probably lucky you're in a very good field, and not besides Elizabeth, there's also like Susan Carey, who's also very familiar with the literature, and then there are philosophers who really mean well and engage in very, very meaningful ways. So from the tradition of Fodor to Ed Mashery, I would say just to give a more broad stroke characterization, I think it's fair to say that this is kind of like the SPP model. I imagine you've been to SPP. And the irony was, I think as of just a few years ago, we are from the ASSC side, obviously, consciousness. And a lot of the ASSC folks don't go to SPP. SPP is Society for Philosophy and Psychology. In fact, I think as of about 10 years ago, before the current crisis happened in the field, some of you know what I'm talking about, ASSC looked down on SPP. ASSC feel that we have a better model because the philosophers who came to our conferences they know the empirical literature better or something. We used to think ASSC is a better model. And of course, within philosophy of mind, it's almost fair to say philosophy of mind is a pretty high-ranked area in terms of how influential they are. And I think ASSC traditionally also, speaking as an old person who grew up in the conference, we traditionally also have a way to look down on not just SPP, but also HSP, History and Philosophy of Science, HPS, History and Philosophy of Science. We don't think these areas are doing nearly as well as ourselves. But I think in the past 10 years, my own view completely changed, and I think there is a lot to learn from. If you want to continue to keep the philosophers engaged and do things together with us, we really need to look at how SPP is doing things, how History and Philosophy of Science are doing things. Because I think so back to today's topic, we're not talking about philosophy and science in general, we're talking about philosophy and science in the context of consciousness. And what I think is, the objective potential and parameters are there. It's just that in the last few years, I think we have gone to a rather dark place where useful things are not happening as much as harmful things anymore.
Any other sharing?
So if no one else,
Is there anyone else?
sorry.
So after,
Hello?
yeah.
So I think one way to think about how to collaborate with scientists is to think about one very concrete question. Which author you want to be? Do you want to be the first author? Do you want to be the final one? Do you want to be the second author? Do you want to be just part of the lab but not the author? So in my case, I try to learn some details about the experiment, and then I realize I'm not able to learn, or I'm not diligent enough to learn. So far, my collaboration with scientists are always taking part of the least important role. So sometimes I'm included by them, maybe in the middle, sometimes not. It doesn't really matter that much. I think most of the time, my own role is kind of redundant. But I've seen successful cases in which people learn much more than myself, and they become first author, meaning that they are designing, leading experiments. Maybe in the future, they can even have a lab by themselves as a philosopher. Some of them are very good philosophers, but they don't want to do experiments. So they read the empirical literatures very carefully. They still write very good papers. So I think one very concrete way to think about how to collaborate is to think about this kind of very concrete question. Although it might sound very practical, maybe, I don't know, there's some negative terms you can think of. But it helps to be, maybe for me, to be more focused on what I want to do and comparing with other people's role. Thank you.
Do anyone have a comment? Yeah.
I know we can do the direct confrontation. No, so actually we have too much to agree, but just to kind of pick hair, one thing is about when Tanaka-san mentioned about Freud. I thought that it's not just, I can ask you, hopefully it might provoke some response to. Freud has a very special place in our field. I was brought up in a tradition where using Freud to liken someone else's behavior is considered like throwing dirt. It's like really, because Freud, where I was trained in England, in a monkey lab, basically, Freud is like the most evil thing ever. So to put in context, like you mentioned about some of the Freudian ideas, how influenced, but you really sum up what Freud has done for psychology. There is a thing to be said, and Heinzig actually said it in a book that is very clearly argued and well documented. Freud basically set psychology back for like half a century. You think about why, the reason is the concepts are maybe right. Some of them are not his original ideas. Some of them he claimed to be original ideas turned out not to be so, and he behaved by and large like a dictator. When his students disagree with him, he kicked them out from a group, and it's very like tight control. It's a bit like a pope, like a cow guru kind of figure. And what what that happened was that culture really hurt psychology and led psychology to completely losing credibility. So in the whole psychodynamic tradition basically died off in the English-speaking world. Not so much because the ideas were bad, but because of how he behaved and how he pushed for those ideas and how he disregarded the important evidence. That turned out to really backfire. And I get to nicely add to the point, like, yeah, you can trace an idea to Freud, you can trace an idea to Descartes, you can trace an idea to Ryle, but yeah, the ideas were traced backwards, right? So in hindsight, all is said and done, you can always find someone who said something good. I imagine people would be able to do that even for politicians of our times that we really don't like. So, you know, you always go back to like, oh, Reagan did this good thing. Yeah, of course it did some good thing. But you really look forward as how the whole program has contributed. Sometimes it can be very negative, and how do we avoid that, or how do we keep tally? That seems to be difficult. Because usually in keeping tally, we just look at the literature and say, oh, this is a Kantian idea. So we ascribe this to Kant and say, oh, so we make Kantian philosophy look very profound and all that. But do we actually do the forward evaluation and look at what Kant was doing at this time, how it actually impacted the field? Was it actually positive or negative?
Well, thank you for asking. Well, yeah, first of all, about Freud. I'm not really, for me personally, I'm not very fond of Freudian ideas or psychodynamic school, but well, he said something very important in the context of consciousness research, because he denied, as I talked in my introduction, he denied the primacy of awareness, because based on his clinical observation, he talked about the unconscious, right? And unconscious does not appear from the first-person perspective, and probably in the context of current scientific research of consciousness, probably there's very few people who really talks about this issue, and I wanted to bring your attention to this issue that probably most of us have hidden tendency to emphasize the first-person perspective and its importance, and what is it like is the phenomena how it appears to the first person, right? But Freud denies that the core concept of Freudian unconscious denied this way of conceptualizing consciousness. So it is one thing that could be emphasized once again now and here. The second point is that, well, knowing philosophy is really time-consuming. I agree that it's really time-consuming because so many ideas are developed through historical debates. So when you have to learn philosophy, you need to get into that kind of historical aspect. But sometimes I think it is good because science also has its own history, right? And all the impactful ideas or impactful innovative researches appears on the right context of the history. So to locate for the researchers to locate their own ideas in the history of science, probably they need to look back the historical ideas and its development, and it is higher than with philosophy. So I think sometimes it is good if you have time. It's good.
Any other questions? Yeah.
My question is addressed to Professor Tanaka. Because you mentioned that there are philosophical concepts in science, and scientists assume philosophical concepts, and that might be good if philosophy can get into it. My question is, because in philosophy, when philosophers talk about philosophical concepts, they care about whether the concepts are accurate or true. But in the case of science, even scientists might talk about more philosophical concepts that they often use them in some sorts of operative, and they just want useful concepts. So I just want to ask, can you say a bit more about that? And because if the scientists just want some concepts that are useful for his research. And does that really need philosopher to get in and make the concepts clear or accurate or true and so on? Thank you.
Well, sorry, I don't think I got your intention of your question. Well, can you spell out a bit?
Okay.
Well, I don't know what to reply to.
Yeah. It's maybe the scientist just use these philosophical concepts in his other work, but it doesn't mean that he thinks those concepts are true, or just those he wants to describe this phenomenon, or he wants some sort of background, conceptual framework, so that by that kind of conceptual framework, he can produce some results and so on. It's not clear to me that the scientist needs some sort of very clear or true concepts. But in the philosophers are interested in finding out true concepts or accurate concepts. So it seems that the philosopher and the scientist might both work on philosophical concepts, but their purposes are different. So that's my question. So you think in science there are philosophical concepts, and I agree. I want to know more about what you think about how philosophy can actually contribute to science.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking. Well, probably this is the reason that I have not been so attracted by the analytic tradition, because it insists on true or false question, right? But well, my background of phenomenology is a bit different because what we emphasize the most, or probably Professor Taguchi will talk about tomorrow, but going back to things themselves is the most important thing. So, so for the phenomenologists is to see things as they appear is the first primacy. So it is not the true or false question, but let's find the fact together. It is the attitude of the phenomenologist. So probably it would be also to emphasize what the program and what we are going to find as a fact, and emphasizing the phenomena itself is the very important point to share among the philosophers and the scientists.
One more question.
Actually, I was thinking we are still in the session of sharing our experiences, like collaboration. So, something really concrete about that. It's like from my past experience. The question of journals. So I am a philosopher. I have past experience of working with psychologists and psychiatrists, but we care about different kinds of journals, like philosophy journals, science journals, and psychiatry journals. And philosophy journals mean nothing to psychologists and psychiatrists, and psychiatry journals mean nothing basically to philosophers. Of course, there are some good, some nice interdisciplinary journals like Mind and Language or Cognition, where they are supposed to be interdisciplinary, but they are exceptional. So so that's really difficult question. So we work together, and then that's a hard process because we need to learn from each other first, and that takes time and effort. And then, but the result does not really get into the top philosophy journal. The result does not really get into the top science journal. Now, so that's the question. Well, I don't want to be negative about it. I'm really okay, I have been doing that, but the frustration is that, is it really worth it? I mean, and then the Professor Tanaka says, like, if we have time, that might be nice. Yeah, but who has time? I mean, in this kind of, so, I mean, so the question is, I don't think the current systems of evaluation in philosophy and in science, I don't think the current system encourages interdisciplinary things. Of course, there are some meetings, nice meetings like SVP. That's nice. That's where philosophers and scientists come together. Nice discussion. But after the meeting, they go back to their places because there's no top journals, basically. So that makes the real fruitful collaboration really difficult. Well, that's one of the frustrations I have been having. Although I myself, I have the idea of collaboration, but I think that's a difficult problem.
It is a pretty bad problem. So for the scientists, it might be less of a concern in some ways, especially with this productive lab, which they publish like 10 papers a year with multiple authors anyway. So isn't going to influence them that much. So the pure intellectual gain might be worth it. For philosophers, my experience is either one of the two have to be the objective. One is you already have enough philosophy papers, and this is just one thing to add to your area of competence to show that, well, I can also collaborate with scientists. So in that case, then I would recommend you to go as happily to the top psychiatry journals. That would make you look maximally good. So if you already have a few journal of philosophy papers, then having another Lancet paper is going to be good. You're going to be golden. But you have to think about that more. And the other way to do it, which is riskier, which is a good number of people have actually almost completely switched field from a philosophy PhD eventually to a position where they basically run their own lab. In those cases, you would try to fight for the first authorships, and can be a few small papers, but to demonstrate to the point that basically I know how to do this myself. Then actually the career benefit is quite high because the job market in philosophy is quite challenging. And the job market in science is not easy, but there are a lot of postdoc positions, etc. So actually there are a good number of successful cases of people who finished the philosophy PhD with some papers, not a lot of them to give them a job right away, but with those papers they went on to do a postdoc in science and eventually just became a scientist. Then they became someone with a bit of a dual career.
Can I have a comment on this? I think in terms of the stage of the career, because I'm also a philosopher, our field doesn't evaluate joint work as much as sciences. So as a junior person, if you are going for tenure, it might be very risky that you only have a couple of papers that are, you are one of the co-authors rather than the single author. That could negatively influence how your tenure review process goes. Yeah,
First a short comment. Is it working? Okay. Just first a short comment. I think if we just set this aside, I think what constitutes a good philosophy research project and what constitutes a good science research project is very different. And so when it comes to like a interdisciplinary work, then it's really hard to evaluate it in a way that if you just look at for example, a talk and what the questions from philosophers and questions coming from science, they are basically very different. And I think this brings to my second question, which is, so we are having this kind of event, and basically as Ryle explained in the first day, that is to facilitate collaboration. And I think maybe we can also take this chance to to brainstorm what would be a good kind of event to actually really facilitate collaboration, and especially between scientists and philosophers. And so, for example, like this kind of debate session to think about this meta method issue, like how to collaborate. Would it be like a fruitful topic to discuss, or what could we do to bring a better kind of interaction to this community?
Do you have any thoughts on this? Or anyone else from the audience?
So there's one good example, one good event I participated 2 years ago. It's summer seminar for philosophy and neuroscience, or maybe it's a different name. I'll Google it later. So basically, for that kind of thing, you have to have longer time. So in that case, it's 2 weeks, which is quite challenging for everyone. But the first week, you have classes, seminars for philosophers to learn a little bit of science, and the other way around. The second week, so in this first week, you already team up, or you team up before going, and then you can change your team. You can be in 2 teams and so on. Second week, there will be more practical sessions, and the all afternoon sessions, every day you have collaboration, discussion times, and so on. And I think that's very useful. They have been fostering lots of collaborations. There are papers out and so on. I think it doesn't have to be 2 weeks long because it's too challenging. The first week is not necessary because you can learn those things on other occasions. So maybe things like 1 week or at least 5 days for people to get to know each other and maybe team up before going, even though it's flexible. And in that case, people have better ideas about what you want to do, and you read other people's profiles and so on. So it's different from this kind of event. I think both are quite important, but they serve different purposes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. How do we do it with time?
Still have 5 minutes?
Okay, so let's do the wrap up. Who wants to go first?
So we were supposed to wrap up. So yeah, I think I presented a negative view because I was asked to, and I thought it just to be provocative. Overall, I don't think it has to be negative. There are concerns that I had. So basically, maybe what I said is, in trying to engage philosophers in the sciences, it could end up very bad. It can end up actually, given the parameters of the field, actually they could end up, to my mind, be doing damage rather than help, which sometimes is happening. But I think that there is good potential for that to not happen. And essentially, it comes down to this. I think it goes back to a question about how to collaborate. And I always feel like, what do you bring to the table? There are things that scientists are not so easy to do. And I can think of a few things coming from this discussion. One is, there is a kind of research that is actually not lucrative to do. For instance, in my lab, sadly, I'm no longer doing as much psychophysics as I used to, running behavioral stuff. And some of the best work was done by a philosophy student, because that student does not have the same kind of career concern. I don't feel that it's so easy to train people just doing psychophysics and hope that they will get a job at the faculty level at this point in my field, unfortunately. So careers, I think in a sense, philosophers, if you are doing it as a side project to demonstrate one AOC, one additional area of competence, which is to be able to do some empirical work, then actually you guys can take up some of the risk for us to do something that maybe career-wise is not so good for a full-time scientist to do, but you can do on the side. And I think acquiring the AOC has value, to the extent that you have your single author, solid, pure philosophy. Every department that I talk to who hire, they do want people who know the empirical literature. It's just that they don't want people who just do that either. But having that as a side project actually probably is good, so you guys can help a fair bit there. And the other thing I would say is, maybe it's a nice tone to wrap up. Many people have told me that the way I behave is stupid. I should not be saying negative things about people who are way more powerful than I am. And I've known this for a long time, and of course it's stupid. But I would reply, well, because it's how stupid it is, and I have job security, if I don't say it, am I going to wait for the next guy without job security to say it? We all know that some of these negative things need to be said. So I'm happy to be stupid. But on the other hand, this is another thing, like for philosophers, you guys don't have these concerns. You're not going to have your grants rejected by the people I just pissed off. You're not going to have reference letters that are going to come from some of the scientists I just pissed off. So in a way, and also given the nature of the work, for philosophers, you guys will point out something that is deeply wrong and messed up in the field. It is your job. It will actually make you look very good like a critical thinker. So I just urge you to want another way of collaboration instead of doing those psychophysics studies that I cannot do. Maybe sometimes writing critique, writing like really deeply pungent critiques, it actually turned out to be much appreciated. As I always said, like Ned Block's favorite thing is to throw the kitchen sink at us, and look how well he's done. So if you guys feel like joining this debate, there are actually things a lot of scientists are very keen to talk to you guys about how the science actually works beyond what you will read in papers. There are a lot of things that are not strategically advantageous for junior scientists to say themselves, but they are very happy to talk to you.
Well, after all the discussion, I have a feeling that, although there are many programs in order to pursue more collaboration between scientists and philosophers, for example, there are many practical programs of evaluation or the career path, but I'm still sort of positive because, there are not so many actual fields in science where really the philosophers and the scientists could collaborate in this way, and probably this kind of conference doesn't happen in the field of molecular biology, for example, right? But this can happen in the field of consciousness research, right? So probably in the field of consciousness research would be the point of breakthrough where the scientists and philosophers could collaborate in a very good manner, I guess. So, I'd like to send some positive messages to the audience to end up this session.
Okay, so our time is up. Let's thank our two speakers again, and the discussion can continue after the ending of this session.